6-year-old Emma sat on the living room carpet, surrounded by her favorite toys. She was patiently stacking blocks into a tall tower, occasionally glancing at her creation with pride. The house was quiet and cozy, interrupted only by the low murmur of voices coming from the kitchen where her parents were talking. Something in their tone caught Emma's attention. Michael's voice was calm and soothing, but Grace's words carried an irritation Emma had never heard before. Curious, Emma crawled closer to the door, as if playing a spy game, and began to listen. "I can't do this anymore, Michael." Grace's voice trembled. "This pregnancy is already too much for me. And honestly, taking care of her, of Emma." She paused. "I just can't. I need to focus on our baby. Emma, she's not mine. She never was." Emma felt something inside her break. She froze, unable to move. What did Grace mean? Not mine? "Grace, you know she thinks of you as her mother," Michael replied, his voice tense. "This isn't fair to her. She's just a child." "I know, but I can't pretend that nothing's changed." Grace's voice softened to a near whisper. "Our baby has to come first. I can't handle this anymore." Emma couldn't bear to listen any longer. She quietly stood up, trying not to make a sound, and ran to her room. Her small heart pounded like a trapped bird. She climbed onto her bed, wrapped her arms around herself, and finally let the tears flow. At dinner that evening, Grace avoided Emma's gaze, speaking only to Michael. Emma tried to seem unaffected, but inside, she felt invisible, like a stranger in her own family. The next morning, Michael approached Emma as she sat at the breakfast table. His kind eyes looked tired. "Emma, I was thinking," he began cautiously, sitting down next to her. "How would you feel about staying with Grandma Eleanor for a little while? She's been wanting to see you, and I think you'd enjoy it." Emma nodded, but said nothing. Her heart ached, but she couldn't bring herself to say no to her dad. She could feel that he was trying to do something good for her, even if it meant leaving home. Within hours, Michael had packed her things, placed her in the car, and driven her to Grandma Eleanor's house. Eleanor greeted them with a warm smile and a tight hug, but even that couldn't ease the heavy feeling that had settled in Emma's chest. She wanted to ask her dad why Grace no longer wanted to take care of her, but the words wouldn't come. When Michael was leaving, he hugged Emma tighter than usual and whispered, "It's going to be okay, I promise." But Emma wasn't sure she believed him. That day, she learned her world would never be the same again. Emma felt lost in her new home, but Grandma Eleanor did everything she could to surround her with love and care. She made Emma's favorite pancakes with maple syrup for breakfast, read her bedtime stories, and eased her anxiety with small, comforting gestures. Yet, despite all the warmth, Emma couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of loneliness. She missed her home, her dad, and even, strangely enough, Grace. Michael visited her every weekend. When he appeared at the door, Emma couldn't help but smile, but every goodbye felt like a new heartbreak. She asked him about Grace, but his answers were always vague. Grace didn't visit. She didn't call. She didn't even send a message. Emma started to feel more and more unwanted. One evening, as she sat with Eleanor in the kitchen, Emma cautiously asked, "Grandma, who were my real mom and dad?" Eleanor froze for a moment, but quickly collected herself. She had known this question would come sooner or later. "Your parents were wonderful people, Emma," she began gently. "They loved you very much, but one day, when you were very little, there was a car accident. It was terrible. You were the only one who survived. Michael and I were devastated." "What happened after that?" Emma asked, her big eyes fixed on her grandmother. "Grace and Michael adopted you," Eleanor continued. "You know, Grace couldn't have children for a long time. When you and Michael came into her life, it was her dream to have a family. But now," Eleanor sighed, "now she's expecting a baby. It's a miracle. Maybe when the baby is born, she'll change." Emma thought about her grandmother's words. Her mind was flooded with new questions. Why had everything changed? Why didn't Grace want to be her mom anymore? That night, Emma lay awake for hours, trying to make sense of it all. The next day, Eleanor took her to the local park to distract her. They swung on the swings, fed the ducks by the pond, but Emma still felt empty inside. Even the bright sun and the laughter of other children couldn't cheer her up. All she could hope for was that her dad would visit again next weekend, so she could feel just a little bit like she belonged somewhere. Several weeks had passed since Emma began living with Grandma Eleanor. She was starting to adjust to her new routine, but her heart still longed for home and her dad. His visits remained the highlight of her week. When he came, Emma clung to him, trying to spend every minute together, but every goodbye shattered her heart a little more. One evening, Michael arrived later than usual. His face was serious, and his eyes were red as if he'd been crying. Eleanor immediately noticed something was wrong. "Michael, what is it?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. He lowered his eyes and spoke quietly. "It's Grace. There were complications. She didn't make it." Emma stood in the corner of the room, listening to their conversation. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Grace was gone? The news hit her like a thunderbolt. Despite feeling rejected by Grace, she had still been a part of Emma's life. Now she was gone, and it felt final and irreversible. Michael walked over to Emma, knelt down, and pulled her into a tight hug. "We'll get through this, sweetheart," he whispered. "I promise. We'll get through this." A few days later, Michael brought Emma back home. The house felt different, as if something fundamental had shifted. It was quiet, almost hollow. Michael tried to fill the void with his care for Emma. They cooked dinner together, took walks in the neighborhood park, and watched movies in the evenings. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Months went by. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Michael spoke cautiously. "Emma, there's something I need to talk to you about." She looked at him, trying to understand what he was about to say. "I have a friend," he began. "Her name is Sarah. She's really nice, and I'd like you to meet her." Emma froze. Her father's words sent a wave of anxiety crashing over her. She thought of Grace. Her coldness and the fear of being unwanted pierced her heart again. She didn't want to meet this new woman. What if she turned out to be just like Grace? What if her dad stopped wanting to be with her? "I don't want to," she said sharply and ran to her room, slamming the door. Michael didn't push her. He knew she needed time, but he also knew he would have to introduce her to Sarah eventually. He believed that, with patience and love, Emma would be able to open her heart again, but it would take time. Emma was still avoiding any talks about Sarah, but Michael didn't rush her. He knew she was going through too many changes in too short a time. Still, he believed that with patience and care, they could overcome any obstacle. A few weeks later, Michael decided it was time for Emma to meet Sarah. They met at a local cafe where Sarah offered Emma an ice cream. Emma sat silently, staring at the table, while Sarah, noticing her discomfort, didn't try to force a conversation. Instead, she smiled and talked about how pretty their ice cream cups were. Her calmness and kindness slowly began to chip away at the wall of distrust Emma had built. The first meetings were tense, but over time, Emma began to warm up to Sarah. Sarah didn't try to replace Grace or force Emma to accept her. She was simply there, patient, attentive, and ready to listen. Soon, Michael and Sarah got married. Emma received the news without much enthusiasm, but she no longer felt the sharp fear she had in the beginning. When they started living together, Emma noticed that Sarah genuinely cared for her. She cooked Emma's favorite meals, helped with her homework, and always found time for walks or conversations. Slowly, Emma began to open up. A year after the wedding, the family experienced a joyous event. Sarah gave birth to a baby boy they named Jack. Emma watched the newborn with a mix of curiosity and caution. She was afraid she would once again be pushed aside, but her fears turned out to be unfounded. Michael and Sarah continued to give her plenty of attention, and Emma realized that Jack wasn't a threat. He was part of their family. The next 2 years were filled with happiness and warm moments, but one day, a tragedy struck that turned their world upside down. Michael died in a car accident. It was sudden and devastating. Emma felt as if her heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She remembered her biological parents, who had died the same way, and couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow her fault. "It's not your fault," Sarah reassured her, holding her tightly as Emma sobbed. "It's not your fault, Emma. We just have to be strong and keep going. We have each other." Emma nodded silently, tears still streaming down her cheeks. She could feel that Sarah genuinely wanted to help her, and that warmed her heart a little. Despite all the grief, Emma began to understand that family wasn't just about blood ties. It was about those who stayed by your side through pain and loss. Sarah had proven she was willing to be a true mother to Emma, and Jack reminded her that life could continue, even after the hardest trials. After Michael's death, Emma and Sarah tried their best to support each other. Despite their fears and pain, they grew closer. Sarah was patient, giving Emma the time she needed to grieve, and became more and more like the mother Emma had always wanted. Jack, though still a baby, became a sort of bridge between them. His laughter and innocent mischief brought smiles to their faces, even on the hardest days. One evening, as Sarah was reading Emma a bedtime story, there was a knock at the door. It was representatives from Child Protective Services. They politely but firmly explained that Sarah didn't have the legal rights to care for Emma. The girl, they said, needed to be placed with another family. Sarah was devastated. "But I'm her mother," she exclaimed. "I've cared for her. I love her as my own." "We're very sorry," the woman replied. "But as a single mother without legal adoption, you cannot keep the child. We're required to follow the law." Emma froze when she heard those words. They wanted to take her away again. She was being left behind. Again. It was her worst nightmare come to life. Sarah tried to fight, but her protests changed nothing. Emma was taken away. She ended up in a group home where she was given a temporary placement. She felt out of place among the other children, and every day seemed endless. Sarah tried to visit her, but Emma refused to see her. She thought Sarah had abandoned her, and she shut herself off from the world. Over time, Emma's heart grew cold. Months passed. One morning, the same woman from the Child Protective Services approached her. "I have some news," she said gently. "We found you a permanent family." Emma showed no reaction. She no longer believed that anyone truly cared for her. That same day, she was called into the director's office. Emma entered, expecting nothing special, but when her eyes fell on the figure of the woman sitting at the desk, she froze. It was Sarah. Emma," Sarah said, standing up from her chair. "I'm so sorry. I've been fighting for you all this time. They didn't want to let me adopt you because I'm single, but I proved to them I could be your mom, and now we're together again." Emma stood still, unable to believe her eyes. Slowly she approached Sarah, her lips trembling and tears welling up in her eyes. "Is it true?" she whispered. Sarah smiled, tears sparkling in her own eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, it's true. I'm your mom now, officially and forever." Emma ran into her arms, feeling safe for the first time in a long while. "I never forgot you," Sarah whispered, stroking her back. "You've always been my daughter, and I'll never let you go again." Emma held her tightly, feeling the coldness in her heart finally melt away. She had found her family again.